Welcome to Reading Bear. Today we've got a story where OP's entitled parents demanded access to his cabin, so he gave them exactly what they asked for. So this happened about 2 years ago, and I'm still amazed at how spectacularly my parents managed to screw themselves over. This is definitely one of those situations where someone's own greed and entitlement came back to bite them hard. Some background first. I'm in my early 30s, been working in tech for about 8 years now. I've always been pretty good with money. Never been flashy about it, but I save well and invest smart. My parents, on the other hand, have always been terrible with finances. They're both in their late 50s. My dad works in sales and my mom does part-time retail. They've never owned a house, always rented, and they blow money on stupid stuff constantly. New cars they can't afford, expensive vacations on credit cards, the latest gadgets, you name it. Despite their financial disasters, they've always acted like they know better than everyone else, especially me. They constantly give unsolicited advice about how I should spend my money, usually involving me giving them some of it. I've learned to gray rock them pretty effectively over the years, but they still try. About 3 years ago, I finally had enough saved up to buy a small cabin up in the mountains. It's nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom place about 2 hours from the city, but it's mine. I bought it outright, no mortgage, because I hate debt. The cabin sits on about 2 acres of wooded land, pretty secluded. Perfect for weekend getaways when I need to disconnect from everything. The cabin became my sanctuary. I'd go up there probably twice a month, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. I fixed it up over time, nothing major, just making it more comfortable. Added a better heating system, upgraded the kitchen a bit, built a small deck. It wasn't expensive work, but it made the place really nice. My parents knew about the cabin, obviously. I made the mistake early on of showing them pictures and telling them about some of the improvements I was making. They seemed impressed at first, which should have been my first red flag. My parents are only impressed by things they want. The first hint of trouble came last spring. My mom called me up and started talking about how nice it must be to have a place to get away from it all. She mentioned how stressful their lives had been lately, how they could really use a break. I could see where this was heading, so I kept the conversation short and didn't take the bait, but they kept bringing it up. Every time I talked to them, somehow the conversation would turn to the cabin. How peaceful it must be. How lucky I was to have it. How they'd love to see it sometime. I kept deflecting, but they were persistent. The real problem started in late summer. My dad called me up and just straight up asked if they could use the cabin for a long weekend. I told him no, I had plans that weekend. This was true. I was actually planning to go up there myself with some friends for a guy's trip. He got really pushy about it, asking why I was being so selfish, saying that family should share with family. He started laying on the guilt thick, talking about how hard they both worked and how they deserved a nice vacation. I held firm and said no. That's when things got weird. A few days later, my mom called me crying. She said they were both so stressed from work that they really needed to get away. And couldn't I just let them use the cabin for one weekend? She made it sound like I was being cruel and heartless for saying no. I tried to explain that the cabin was my personal retreat, that I had saved for years to buy it, and that I liked having control over when and how it was used. This apparently made me even more selfish in their eyes. The calls kept coming. Sometimes it was just one of them, sometimes both. They'd call separately to try different tactics. Dad would get angry and demanding. Mom would get weepy and guilt-trippy. They started involving other family members too, calling my aunt and my brother to complain about how mean I was being. Finally, about 2 months ago, they came up with a new strategy. They called me up together on speakerphone and made what they called a reasonable proposal. They wanted me to give them a key to the cabin so they could use it whenever I wasn't there. They argued that since I wasn't using it all the time, it was wasteful for it to just sit empty. They presented this like they were doing me a favor, like they'd be maintaining the place for me and keeping an eye on it. They promised they'd be respectful. They wouldn't mess with my stuff. They'd clean up after themselves. All they wanted was access when I wasn't using it. I said absolutely not. The cabin was mine. I paid for it, and I didn't want anyone else having access to it. This led to a huge fight. They accused me of being selfish and ungrateful, said I'd forgotten where I came from, the whole guilt trip playbook. Dad got particularly nasty about it. He started lecturing me about family obligations and how I owed them because they raised me. He said I was being unreasonable and stubborn, and that I should want to share my good fortune with the people who brought me into this world. That's when he made the demand that would come back to haunt him. He said, and I remember this part clearly because it was so ridiculous, "You know what? Fine. If you're going to be this way, then we're just going to have to take matters into our own hands. You can't keep us away from family property forever." I asked him what he meant by family property, since I was the one who bought it with my own money. He said that as my parents, they had rights too, and that I couldn't just exclude them from something this important. Then Mom chimed in with her own ultimatum. We raised you and supported you your whole life. The least you could do is let us use the cabin when we need it. If you won't give us a key, then we'll just have to find another way. I was getting really irritated by this point. These people were acting like they had some legal claim to my property just because they were my parents, so I decided to call their bluff. Fine, I said. You want access to the cabin so badly? You think you have rights to it? Then go ahead and try to exercise those rights. See how that works out for you. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then Dad asked what I meant by that. Exactly what I said. You think you have some claim to my cabin? Go ahead and try to enforce it. I'm not stopping you. This was my malicious compliance moment. They were demanding access to my property based on some imaginary family rights. So I was literally giving them permission to try to take what they thought was theirs. I knew they had no legal standing whatsoever, but I figured if they wanted to make fools of themselves trying, I'd let them. Mom asked if I was giving them permission to use the cabin. I said I wasn't giving them permission for anything. I was just telling them that if they really believed they had rights to it, they were welcome to try to exercise those rights. Dad seemed to think this was some kind of victory. He said something about how I was finally being reasonable and that they'd work something out. I corrected him and said I wasn't being reasonable at all. I was just curious to see how far they'd take their ridiculous claims. The call ended on that confusing note. I'm pretty sure they thought they'd won some kind of concession from me. In reality, I'd just given them enough rope to hang themselves with. I didn't hear from them for about a week after that call. I figured they were planning something, but I wasn't too worried about it. After all, what could they actually do? They didn't have keys. They didn't know the security code for the alarm system I'd installed. And they certainly didn't have any legal right to be there. I decided to set up some additional security measures just in case. I installed a couple of trail cameras around the property, the kind hunters use that are motion activated and send pictures to your phone. I also changed the locks on the cabin, not because I thought they had keys, but because I wanted to be extra careful. The first sign that they were up to something came about 10 days later. I got a motion alert from one of my cameras around noon on a Thursday. I checked the app on my phone and saw my dad's car slowly driving up the dirt road that leads to my cabin. He seemed to be checking the place out, driving really slowly and looking around. I watched him park in front of the cabin and get out. He walked around the property for a few minutes, trying to look in windows, checking doors. At one point, he tried the front door handle, but obviously it was locked. After about 20 minutes of this, he got back in his car and left. I was curious, but not too concerned. Maybe he was just satisfying his curiosity about the place. I'd never actually brought them up there, so this was probably his first time seeing it in person. But then I got another alert 2 days later. This time it was both of them, and they had a pickup truck with them that I didn't recognize. They parked and got out, and this time they were clearly up to something. Dad had a crowbar with him, and Mom was carrying what looked like cleaning supplies. I watched in amazement as my dad started trying to pry open the back door of my cabin. It took him about 15 minutes, but he managed to pop the lock. Then they both went inside. I was pissed, obviously, but also kind of fascinated. This was breaking and entering, plain and simple. They were literally committing felonies because they thought they had some kind of right to my property. I decided to let them dig their hole a little deeper before I did anything about it. The cameras inside the cabin caught everything. They spent about 3 hours in there that first day. Mom was cleaning the place top to bottom. Even though I'd left it pretty clean, Dad was walking around like he owned the place, checking out all the improvements I'd made, going through my stuff. At one point, Dad called someone on his phone. From what I could make out from the footage, he was talking to someone about the cabin, describing it and talking about how nice it was. He seemed to be bragging about it, like it was his place. They finally left around dinner time, but not before Dad did something that really pissed me off. He made a copy of my house key, using some kind of key copying tool he'd brought with him. Apparently, he'd thought this through enough to come prepared for that. I was tempted to call the cops right then, but I was curious to see how far they'd push this. Plus, I was getting some great footage of them committing multiple felonies. I figured I'd let them rack up a few more charges before I lowered the boom. Sure enough, they came back the next weekend. This time, they brought suitcases. I couldn't believe what I was watching. They pulled up Saturday morning with the same pickup truck, but now it was loaded with stuff. Suitcases, boxes of food, what looked like some of their personal belongings. They were actually moving in. Mom had brought a bunch of her toiletries and set them up in the master bathroom like she lived there. Dad brought his fishing gear and set it up on the deck. They unpacked groceries and filled up my refrigerator with their food. They even brought their own sheets and towels. But the absolute worst part was when they called some of their friends and invited them over. I watched through the cameras as two other couples showed up Saturday afternoon. Dad was giving them tours of his cabin, showing off the improvements he'd made, talking about what a great retreat it was. They had a whole dinner party that night. 8 people total, eating off my dishes, using my furniture, treating my cabin like it was my parents' place. Dad was playing host, grilling on my deck, pouring drinks for everyone. Mom was showing off the kitchen like she'd designed it herself. I was recording all of this, of course. Every minute of it. I had them dead to rights for breaking and entering, burglary, trespassing, and probably a few other charges I couldn't think of off the top of my head. But I still wasn't done letting them hang themselves. I wanted to see just how brazen they'd get. Sunday morning, Dad made a phone call that I managed to pick up through the cameras. He was calling some kind of contractor, asking about getting estimates for an addition to the cabin. He was talking about adding another bedroom and maybe expanding the deck. He was making long-term plans for my property, like he owned it. That afternoon, they went into town and came back with a bunch of stuff from the hardware store. Dad spent the rest of Sunday trying to install some kind of new lock system on the front door. I guess he was worried about security, which was pretty ironic considering how they'd gotten in. Their friends left Sunday evening, but my parents stayed. They were clearly planning to make this a regular thing, maybe even a permanent thing. Mom had brought enough clothes for a week, and Dad had brought his laptop and some work stuff. Monday morning, I called in sick to work. I had some serious business to take care of. First, I called the local sheriff's office. I explained the situation to the deputy, who answered that my parents had broken into my cabin and were currently occupying it without permission. I told him I had video evidence of the break-in and that they were currently trespassing on my property. The deputy seemed a little confused at first. He asked if there was some kind of family dispute going on, like maybe there was some question about who owned the property. I assured him there was no question at all. The cabin was mine. I had the deed. I paid the taxes, and my parents had zero legal right to be there. I offered to email him some of the video footage as evidence, which he said would be helpful. I sent him the clearest shots I had of Dad breaking in, plus some footage from inside showing them moving their stuff in and making themselves at home. The deputy called me back about an hour later. He said he'd reviewed the footage and that there was definitely enough evidence for breaking and entering and trespassing charges. He said they could send someone up to the cabin that afternoon to remove my parents and potentially arrest them. I said that would be perfect. At this point, I decided to drive up to the cabin myself. I wanted to be there when the cops showed up, partly to make sure everything went smoothly, and partly because I was curious to see my parents' faces when reality came crashing down on them. I parked down the road a bit and walked up through the woods so they wouldn't see me coming. The sheriff's deputy was supposed to arrive around 3 p.m., and I wanted to be in position to watch the show. My parents were on the deck when I got there, just relaxing like they owned the place. Dad was reading a book in one of my deck chairs. Mom was doing some kind of crossword puzzle. They looked completely comfortable and settled in. I found a spot in the trees where I could see the deck, but they couldn't see me, and I waited. The deputy showed up right on time. Actually, it was 2 deputies in 2 separate cars, which surprised me. I guess they were taking this seriously. I watched as the cops walked up to the deck. Dad saw them coming and stood up, probably wondering what they wanted. The conversation was too far away for me to hear clearly, but I could see the body language, and it was priceless. At first, Dad seemed confused, but not worried. He was probably thinking they were just checking on something, maybe asking for directions or something. But as the conversation went on, I could see him getting more agitated. Mom had come over to join the conversation, and she was doing a lot of gesturing and pointing. I'm guessing she was trying to explain their side of the story, probably claiming they had permission to be there or something. But the deputies weren't buying it. One of them was taking notes, and the other one was talking on his radio. This went on for about 10 minutes, with my parents getting more and more animated. Then I saw one of the deputies pull out handcuffs, and things got really interesting. Dad absolutely lost his mind. He started yelling and waving his arms around. Even from where I was hiding, I could hear him shouting something about family rights and how this was all a misunderstanding. Mom was crying and trying to calm him down, but he was having none of it. The deputy tried to get Dad to calm down, but he kept escalating. Finally, they had enough and put him in handcuffs. Mom was begging them not to arrest him, promising they'd leave immediately and never come back. But it was too late for that. Dad had already broken multiple laws, and his performance for the deputies probably didn't help his case any. They put Mom in handcuffs too, though she was a lot more cooperative about it. Then they loaded both of them into the back of one of the police cars. I waited until the cops left before I came out of the woods. The second deputy had stayed behind to make sure I was actually the owner of the property, which I was able to prove with my deed and driver's license. He told me that my parents would probably be charged with breaking and entering, burglary, and criminal trespassing. He said the fact that they'd moved their stuff in and invited other people over made it worse, because it showed intent to permanently deprive me of my property. I gave him copies of all the video footage I had, including the stuff from inside the cabin, showing them unpacking and making themselves at home. He said it was some of the best evidence he'd ever seen for this kind of case. After the deputy left, I went inside to assess the damage. Honestly, they hadn't destroyed anything, but the place was a mess. They'd rearranged furniture, left dirty dishes everywhere, and generally treated it like their personal vacation home. It took me the rest of the day to clean up their mess and get everything back the way I wanted it. I also changed all the locks again and upgraded my security system. The legal consequences for my parents were pretty severe. Dad ended up getting charged with breaking and entering, burglary, criminal trespassing, and something called criminal mischief for making the unauthorized key copy. Mom got charged with burglary and criminal trespassing. Since they couldn't afford a lawyer, they got public defenders. Dad's lawyer tried to argue that this was a family dispute and that he'd misunderstood my permission, but the video evidence made that pretty hard to sell. The prosecutor offered them a plea deal. Dad would get 2 years probation and 200 hours of community service, plus restitution for damages. Mom would get 1 year probation and 100 hours of community service. The alternative was going to trial, where they could potentially face jail time if convicted. They took the plea deal. The restitution part was particularly satisfying. They had to pay for all the lock changes, the security system upgrades, and my time off work to deal with this mess. It came out to about $3,000, which was more than they could afford. They also had to write me formal apology letters as part of their probation. Dad's letter was barely apologetic and mostly focused on how he'd been trying to help family. Mom's was a little better, but still full of excuses about how stressed they'd been and how they'd just wanted a nice vacation. The best part was that their arrest made the local newspaper. It was just a small item in the police blotter, but it mentioned their names and the charges. Several people they knew saw it and called to ask what had happened. They were completely humiliated. Their friends who'd been at the dinner party were mortified when they found out the truth. Apparently, my parents had told them the cabin belonged to the family and that they had every right to use it. When word got out that they'd actually broken in, those friendships pretty much ended. My extended family heard about it too, of course. My aunt, who had been pressuring me to be more generous with my parents, suddenly went very quiet on the subject. My brother, who had also been taking their side, actually called to apologize for getting involved. As for my relationship with my parents, well, it's pretty much over. They blame me for ruining their lives and getting them arrested over nothing. They can't seem to understand that they brought this entirely on themselves by breaking into my property. I haven't spoken to them since the plea hearing. They've tried calling a few times, mostly when they need help with something, but I don't answer. I figure if they thought they could just take what they wanted from me, they can learn to handle their own problems. The cabin is more peaceful than ever now. I've been up there probably a dozen times since this all happened, and every time I'm reminded of how well everything worked out. I got exactly what I wanted. My parents learned that they have no claim to my property, and I got some great entertainment watching them destroy their own lives trying to prove otherwise. Looking back, I'm actually glad they pushed it as far as they did. If I'd called the cops the first time they broke in, they might have gotten off with just a warning. But by letting them really commit to their delusion, moving in, inviting friends over, making long-term plans, they ended up facing serious criminal charges. The funniest part is that if they'd just been patient and respectful, I probably would have let them visit the cabin occasionally. Not move in or have their own key, but maybe a weekend here and there if they'd asked nicely and hadn't been so entitled about it. Instead, their greed and sense of entitlement cost them thousands of dollars, got them criminal records, and destroyed our relationship entirely. They demanded access to my cabin, and I gave them exactly what they asked for. I let them try to take it. The fact that their attempt was completely illegal and doomed to fail was their problem, not mine. Sometimes the best way to deal with unreasonable people is to let them be unreasonable until it bites them in the ass. My parents wanted to find out what their imaginary rights to my cabin were worth. Thanks to their criminal records and probation officers, now they know exactly what those rights are worth. Absolutely nothing. I still get updates on their legal situation occasionally, since I'm listed as the victim in their cases. Dad violated his probation once by missing some community service hours, which got him in trouble with his probation officer. Mom has been compliant with hers, but the financial burden of the restitution has been tough on them. They had to sell some of their possessions to pay me back, including Dad's beloved motorcycle and Mom's jewelry collection. Every time I think about them having to liquidate their stuff to pay for their attempt to steal mine, I smile a little. The cabin has never been more relaxing. There's something deeply satisfying about sitting on my deck, looking out over my property, knowing that it's completely and undeniably mine. No more guilt trips, no more demands for family sharing, no more entitled parents thinking they can help themselves to what I've worked for. Just peace, quiet, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes giving people exactly what they ask for is the perfect revenge. Anyway, thank you for watching. See you again tomorrow.